Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
Your sister just got promoted again. My dad's voice cut through the lazy hum of Easter brunch like the clink of a fork against an empty plate. Vice President, can you believe it? When will you finally catch up, Jenna? He said it with a smile, that trademark grin of his that pretended to be harmless, just a casual little jab wrapped in fatherly affection. But I knew better. I'd seen that smile twist into something colder more times than I could count, like when I dropped out of grad school, or when I told him I didn't want to get married at 25 like Emily. That grin was his weapon of choice, and he wielded it every holiday like clockwork. Right there in the middle of the kitchen, he renovated for Mom's 60th pale cabinets, glass wine rack, quartz counters that somehow still smelled like pine sol and disappointment. He dropped the line like a landmine. The table went quiet in that weird way it always did when Dad decided it was time to make a point. Uncle Dave paused mid-chew, raising his eyebrows over a half-eaten deviled egg. Mom pretended to refill her mimosa though her glass was still half full, and Emily offered a tight-lipped smile like she was caught in a photo shoot she didn't ask for. She didn't look proud or smug. She looked exhausted. But that didn't stop Dad from pushing his point a little further, like he always did, like he needed to draw blood before he backed off. Come on, we're all proud of her. She's doing big things. But I know you've got something cooking too, right? His voice tried to take a softer tone, but it reeked of the same condescension it always carried. He never just asked how I was doing. It was always a comparison. A ranking. A test I hadn't studied for because I knew the grade was already decided. I didn't look at him. I didn't look at any of them. I just picked up my drink, a cheap mimosa in a thick glass that still had lipstick from whoever poured before me, and took the slowest, most deliberate sip I could manage without laughing. I set the glass down gently on the table, folded my hands, and finally met his eyes. "Oh, I already caught up," I said. "I just don't share wins with people who doubted me." That was it. One sentence. One simple truth delivered in the tone of a weather report. And just like that, the entire brunch table turned to stone. My father's smile froze, like a man caught mid-sentence in a courtroom he didn't know he'd walked into. His fork hovered over the glazed ham on his plate, motionless. Emily's eyes darted toward Mom, who looked like she might finally choke on that mimosa. Uncle Dave made a low sound, maybe a grunt, maybe a laugh he tried to swallow, but no one said a word. The silence wasn't angry. It wasn't awkward. It was stunned. Like they'd just witnessed something that cracked the surface of a painting they thought was real. In that moment, I realized something I'd always suspected, but never quite confirmed. They didn't know anything about me. Not really. Not where I lived, not what I did, not who I loved, not what I built when I left this house behind. And maybe that was by design. Or maybe it was the consequence of playing the lesser daughter role for so long that they forgot to ask if the story had changed. You see, this wasn't the first time I'd been called out like that, not even close. Holidays with my family were always part family gathering, part passive-aggressive roast, with me as the recurring punchline. When Emily got her scholarship, I got asked why I hadn't applied. When she married Mark, I was grilled about why I was still single. When she bought her first home, Dad handed me a book about financial literacy and said, "Might help you catch up." I used to laugh it off, play my part, deflect with jokes or whine or both. But this year was different. Not because I was angry, no, that passed years ago. It was different because I was done. Done pretending their approval meant anything. Done pretending I hadn't outgrown the need to prove myself. And most importantly, done hiding just how far ahead I'd actually come. I leaned back in my chair and let the silence grow. Not a dramatic lean, just a relaxed one, like I dropped a truth so casual it didn't even need a reaction. I watched my father's eyes narrow slightly, like he was trying to figure out what I meant. That was the best part. He didn't know. He couldn't know. I'd made sure of it. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it. That was a first. Emily reached across the table for the fruit salad and finally said, "This melon's good," in that brittle tone she used when she wanted to change the subject without taking sides. Mom followed suit with a quiet, yes, that felt more like a prayer than an observation. Uncle Dave chuckled, actually chuckled this time, and muttered, "Well, damn. Brunch just got interesting." It was in that strange lull between bites and breath that I remembered the exact moment things shifted for me. It wasn't a big event, not some dramatic betrayal. It was years ago, after I landed my first consulting deal, a 6-month contract with a healthcare startup that paid more than Emily made in a year. I called home out of pure habit, thinking I'd share the news. And when Dad picked up and heard I was freelancing, he sighed and said, "Still not ready for a real job, huh?" That's when I decided, no more updates. No more invitations into my world. If they thought I was drifting, fine. Let them. I'd let them think I was always just a few steps behind, chasing some image of success I never even wanted. I figured someday I'd tell them, maybe over drinks or after Dad had mellowed with age. But now, seeing the look on his face, the one caught between confusion and the slow realization that maybe, just maybe, he didn't know who I'd become, I knew I wasn't going to wait for that day anymore. Let him squirm. Let him wonder. Let him sit with the idea that the daughter he thought was floundering had, without his help or approval, built something bigger than he could ever understand. And maybe, just maybe, this was only the first course. Because I hadn't even gotten to dessert yet. There's a specific kind of silence that settles over you when you're 12 years old, standing in the kitchen doorway with toast burned black in your hand, watching your father beam at your sister while completely ignoring the fact that you just won your school's writing contest, a silence that doesn't scream or cry, but instead coils somewhere behind your ribs and makes itself a permanent resident, whispering again and again, "You're not the one they see." I remember that morning like it just happened last week, the smell of overcooked bread still stuck in my nose, my name barely even acknowledged as Dad clapped Emily on the back because she'd scored the winning goal in her soccer match the day before. As if athletic ability was some currency he recognized, while my words, the story I spent nights writing with a flashlight under the covers, were just a phase, just scribbles, just nice, honey muttered over his newspaper. That moment was small. Not a grand betrayal. Not an overt insult. But it was the start of the pattern, one that would play out for the next 2 decades with stunning consistency and the kind of emotional precision that could make you think you were imagining it. Emily, the golden child, responsible, athletic, personable, the one who followed instructions and smiled for pictures and joined student council without being asked, always had a way of drawing the light without trying. Like someone blessed with a magnet that pulled everyone's attention to her orbit. And me? I was smart, but quiet, creative, but unpredictable, thoughtful, but resistant to structure. I asked questions Dad didn't like, pushed boundaries Mom was too tired to enforce, and I learned quickly that approval in our house wasn't something you were given, it was something you earned by doing exactly what was expected. I wasn't bitter about Emily's shine, not at first. In fact, as kids, I loved her like older sisters are meant to be loved. I thought she was magic. I wore her hand-me-downs like they were heirlooms and tried to copy her cursive in my diary because hers looked like it belonged on a wedding invitation. But as we got older, the love I had started to twist, not because of her, but because of what people, especially our father, saw when they looked at her compared to what they failed to see in me. She got a car when she turned 17, a used silver sedan with a bow on the hood and Dad's arm around her shoulder in every photo. When I turned 17, I got a ride to school and a part-time job application shoved under my bedroom door. She got praised for being responsible. I got told to stop dreaming and get serious. It was relentless, death by 1,000 tiny dismissals. What stung the most wasn't the lack of praise. It was the assumption that I shouldn't be praised. That every small win was either luck or something I'd screw up eventually. When I got into a top-tier university, Dad didn't congratulate me. He asked if I could afford to keep up. When I interned with a design firm in Los Angeles, he called it Arts and Crafts Camp. When I came home one summer with a glowing recommendation letter from a CEO, he said, "Well, it's not a full-time job, is it?" I didn't have the language for what that did to me at the time. I just knew it made me stop telling him things. At first, I thought if I could just show him, he'd come around, that once I had something solid, something shiny, he'd finally treat me like I was worth more than an afterthought. But that's the thing about chasing validation from someone who's never seen your worth. Even when you win, it doesn't feel like a victory. It just feels like survival. Emily and I were never enemies. We weren't best friends either. We occupied parallel worlds with different weather systems, where she lived under a spotlight and I drifted in the shadows by choice, or maybe by resignation. She didn't rub her success in my face, not really. But she never questioned why the spotlight never moved either. She accepted her place as the favorite the same way you accept that the sun rises in the east, not maliciously, just as a fact of life. And I don't think she ever really saw me as someone who was trying. That was the cruel part. She saw me as comfortable in the background, like I'd chosen to be small when in fact I'd simply been taught that being big wasn't an option for me in this family. After college, I moved out of state and never really looked back. I got an apartment I could barely afford, took freelance jobs that barely paid rent, and started from scratch without anyone cheering me on. I learned to work quietly, build slowly, and never announce what I was doing until it was done. I became the kind of person who could make miracles in silence because no one was watching anyway. The moment that changed everything came not from failure, but from an unexpected win. I was 27 when my side hustle, a branding consultancy I built from scratch, landed a retainer with a corporate client that wanted me to lead their rebrand. It was my first 5-figure contract, the kind of deal that used to feel like fiction. I was living in a studio with peeling paint and a fridge that buzzed like a dying lawnmower, and I signed a contract that made me more money in 3 months than my first 2 years combined. I remember staring at my phone after the final deposit hit, wondering if I should call someone, tell someone, scream into the sky. But the only name that popped into my mind was his, and with it came that voice again. He won't care. He'll find a way to make it feel small. So I didn't call. I didn't tell anyone in my family. And that decision, the one that seemed small in the moment, was the beginning of everything. From that day on, I built in silence. I invested, reinvested, hired a team, scaled. I worked my ass off, failed privately, succeeded privately, and let the mystery build like fog around my name. I stopped posting updates. I didn't come home for holidays. I became a ghost in their stories, someone they could neither praise nor punish, someone they simply stopped asking about. But silence is never neutral. It's charged with energy. It collects weight. And mine had been building for almost a decade. So when Dad made that little comment at Easter, with that stupid proud dad smirk, as if I was still 17 and he could shame me into ambition, he had no idea he was speaking to someone who'd already climbed the damn mountain and built a house on top of it. He had no idea what I had done. And more importantly, he had no idea what I was about to do. Because that silence? That old, heavy, bitter silence? It was finally ready to speak. The thing no one tells you about success when you've built it in the shadows is that it doesn't feel like a celebration. It feels like a secret you're almost afraid to touch. It's strange, almost tragic in a way, how victories you once dreamed about as a kid don't explode with confetti or champagne the way you imagined they would, but instead land with a quiet thud, like a letter slipped under a locked door that no one will ever open. I had learned, over the years, that in a world where no one is watching, triumph becomes an intimate act, something you savor in private and protect like a wounded animal. Because the people who should have clapped for you a long time ago have either stopped looking or never truly cared in the first place. By the time I hit 30, I had everything that was once used as a weapon against me: stability, financial independence, leadership, and purpose, but not a single member of my family had the faintest idea what I'd actually become. And the strangest part was, that wasn't an accident. It wasn't something I forgot to share. It was intentional, methodical, and, if I'm being honest, deeply satisfying. There was something exquisitely powerful in holding a truth so weighty, so substantial, that you could walk into a room full of people who underestimated you for years and still smile, knowing they couldn't even begin to grasp what you'd built behind their backs. After I walked away from that first major contract at 27, I reinvested almost every dollar into the business. I didn't buy a fancy car or throw money at clothes or trips like some eager 20-something with something to prove. I lived lean, worked long hours, and poured every bit of strategy, talent, and stubbornness into a small but growing agency focused on brand strategy and high-impact consulting for companies too stuck in their own egos to realize their image was holding them back. Within a year, I was hiring contractors. Within 2, I had employees. By the time I turned 30, I had clients across the country, 2 corporate retainers, a modest office in a downtown high-rise, and a team of 7 working full-time under my lead, people who respected me, trusted me, and saw me for exactly what I was. Not someone trying to catch up, but someone far ahead. And yet, even then, I never told my family. I didn't send photos of my office space, didn't announce team milestones, didn't forward clippings when my work was featured in trade publications or online campaigns. I didn't even invite them to the launch event of one of the largest brand overhauls I'd led for a Fortune 500 client, an event I hosted on a rooftop in Chicago with 200 industry professionals in attendance. I stood there that night under warm string lights with a cocktail in hand, accepting compliments from executives who finally understood what their marketing team couldn't deliver. And all I could think about was how surreal it was that I had become the version of myself I always hoped I'd grow into, and not a single member of my family had any clue. Not one text. Not one call. Not one question. There's a freedom that comes from that kind of disconnection, but it's not the comforting kind. It's sharp-edged, hard-earned, and laced with the ache of every moment you wanted someone to say, "I see you," and knew they never would. I thought maybe, with time, that need would fade. That the urge to prove myself would disappear once the numbers in my bank account hit a certain threshold or once the LinkedIn messages became so saturated with praise that I couldn't keep up. But the truth is, success doesn't erase old wounds, it just gives you better tools to hide the scar tissue. The real shift didn't come from growth or money or even recognition. It came the day I received a private email that sent me into a silence so heavy I could hear my own pulse in my ears. It was a discreet message from a financial firm I worked with, alerting me that a small, privately owned manufacturing business was seeking an emergency bridge investor due to a cash flow crisis. The owner was behind on payroll, facing mounting debt, and needed a discreet capital injection to stay afloat. The firm thought I might be interested because of my previous work with turnaround strategies and my appetite for high-risk, high-reward investments. The name of the company? My father's. I reread that email 4 times in silence, the world narrowing to a pinhole around those few paragraphs. There was no mention of family, no personal plea, just raw numbers, desperate figures, and legal outlines of a man who had spent 3 decades pretending he was invincible. A man who had always looked at me with that half-smile that said, "You'll understand real responsibility one day." And now here he was, or at least his legacy, cracking at the seams without anyone to hold it up. I didn't call him. I didn't gloat. I didn't do anything petty, although God knows I wanted to. Instead, I created a shell company through my legal team, wired the investment under strict anonymity, and watched as the quarterly reports slowly stabilized over the next 6 months. No fanfare, no announcement, just a quiet act of rescue that he would never see coming and maybe never find out about. But I knew. And that was enough, at least for the time being. You could call it pride or maybe pettiness, but it wasn't about vengeance, not yet. It was about reclaiming the balance of power that had always tilted in his favor. It was about proving, if only to myself, that I was no longer that girl holding burnt toast, waiting to be noticed. I was the one holding the torch now, and I could light or extinguish anything I pleased. And as I walked into that Easter brunch a few weeks later, calm and polished in a dress I bought with money earned through sleepless nights and hard negotiations, I knew something no one else at that table knew, not my mother, who still begged me to call more often. Not Emily, who would soon discover that her promotion wasn't the only big news in the room, and certainly not my father, who still thought he had the upper hand. Because while he'd been busy bragging about surviving a rough year in business, while he toasted to my sister's achievements and looked right through me, he had no idea that I had been the one holding up his house of cards the entire time. And as far as I was concerned, that was only the beginning. There's something deceptive about the kind of silence that falls over a family brunch after someone breaks a long-standing, unspoken rule, the rule that says certain things, even if true, are better left unsaid for the sake of peace, for the illusion of unity, for the fragile shell of politeness that keeps people sitting at the same table year after year. It's not real silence, of course, not the comforting kind that fills the air when people are simply enjoying each other's company without needing to speak. No, this kind of silence is dense and brittle, the kind that buzzes beneath the surface like a live wire under wet soil, ready to shock the first person who dares to move. That's what lingered in the air after I said those words that had been simmering inside me for years, carefully aged in the wine cellar of my resentment, waiting for the exact right moment to be poured out in front of the people who thought they knew me. The comment had slipped from my mouth with the ease of someone who had rehearsed it more times than she'd admit. I already caught up. I just don't share wins with people who doubted me. It sounded simple, even calm, but what I saw in my father's eyes in the seconds that followed told me that it had landed with a force I couldn't have anticipated. He didn't say anything, not at first, but his smile, that condescending, smirking little mask he wore like armor, twitched, cracked, and then collapsed entirely, as if a lifetime of control had finally been challenged in a language he didn't understand. Emily, always the peacekeeper when Dad lost his footing, cleared her throat in that tight, professional way that sounded more like a warning than a cough. "Hey," she said, trying to inject just enough warmth into her voice to make it sound like concern instead of caution. "We're just celebrating today. It's not a competition." I turned my eyes slowly toward her, not with hostility, but with the kind of stillness that comes from deep, measured restraint. The kind of restraint you only develop after spending years smiling through backhanded compliments and being expected to laugh at your own expense, while others basked in approval you were never offered. "That's funny," I said, setting down my glass and folding my hands on the table like I was about to pitch a deal, because it's only ever felt like a competition to the people who needed me to lose in order to feel like they were winning. Her face tightened, not with anger, but with discomfort, the kind that comes when someone suddenly places a mirror in front of you that you didn't ask for. I didn't hate Emily, I never had, but that didn't mean I was willing to keep pretending that her hands were clean in all of this, that her quiet acceptance of our father's favoritism hadn't carved its own kind of wound in me. She had played the role so well for so long, the doting daughter, the overachiever, the one who always had something to report at holidays, that I think she genuinely didn't understand what it meant to be invisible in your own family. Dad, ever the patriarchal puppeteer, finally spoke, but his voice had dropped in pitch, lower, tighter, a little frayed around the edges. "No one here's doubted you, Jenna. That's not what this is. We're proud of both of you. We know Emily's path, that's all. She keeps us in the loop." It was such a carefully crafted statement, wrapped in diplomacy, but I saw it for what it really was, a redirection, a shifting of blame, a way to subtly pin the fault back on me for being private, for not feeding him the kind of updates that earned his interest. I smiled, not with amusement but with a calm, cold sense of precision, and replied, "You know her path because you asked about it. Because you've always asked." "Me? You made your mind up years ago." He flinched, not physically, but in that internal way men do when their authority is questioned by someone they thought would always defer. His eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment I could see it, the flicker of confusion, the search for the right defense, the old tools no longer working because the narrative had changed and no one had told him. Across the table, Mom gave me a soft, pleading look, the same one she always gave when she wanted me to back off, to not ruin the holiday, as if my truth was more disruptive than a lifetime of being overlooked. I could have stopped there. I could have let the silence return, let them sit with their discomfort and moved on, but something inside me had shifted, and I wasn't about to pull the curtain halfway open and then pretend the show was over. "It's fine," I said, reaching into my purse and pulling out my phone with the kind of deliberate casualness that made the tension in the room snap even tighter. "Since we're sharing wins today, maybe I'll join in." I tapped a few times, opened a folder, and slid the phone across the table toward Emily, who looked down at the screen like it might bite her. It was a digital article, Forbes, dated 3 weeks prior, a profile on the rebranding of a major consumer wellness brand, detailing the strategy behind its explosive growth over the past year. Halfway through the article, bolded and centered, was my name, Jenna Whitmore, founder and lead strategist at Atria Collective. That's mine, I said, my voice steady. Built it from scratch. Took that company from a 10 million valuation to 120 million in under 12 months. No one spoke. I reached forward, took the phone back, and turned to Dad. The same agency, by the way, that quietly invested in Whitmore Industrial when it was hemorrhaging money last spring. His mouth parted slightly, like he was trying to form a response, but couldn't decide which part to react to first, the fact that I'd built a company he'd never heard of, or the revelation that I had saved his company from collapse and done so without ever giving him the satisfaction of knowing who'd thrown the rope. "That's not possible," he said, his voice cracking at the edges. "That was an anonymous investor. We were told." "I know," I interrupted, my tone calm, almost kind. "We used a dummy firm, just like your lawyer did when he wanted to hide assets during that tax situation you never told Mom about." Now her face dropped, pale and stunned, and Emily turned sharply toward me. "Jenna," she said, a warning in her voice, but I held up a hand. "It's fine," I said again, standing slowly, brushing non-existent crumbs off my lap. "You don't have to say anything. I didn't tell you all this for applause. I told you because I'm done pretending to be the one who hasn't done anything with her life." The room was frozen, every person stuck between shame, confusion, and the dawning realization that the roles they had come to depend on no longer applied. Dad looked like someone who had just realized the ground under him had been moved, not by a competitor, not by fate, but by his own daughter, the one he never bothered to check on unless it was to make a joke or point out what she was missing. I picked up my glass, drained the last of the mimosa, and set it down with a soft clink that somehow echoed through the room like a gavel. "Anyway," I said, almost cheerfully, "congrats again on your promotion, Emily. It's great to see someone's getting recognized." And with that, I walked toward the door, not in anger, not in triumph, but with the kind of quiet satisfaction that only comes when you've told your truth, held your ground, and left the table exactly the way you planned, without needing to be invited back. As I stepped out onto the porch, the spring air hung thick with that peculiar stillness that follows a storm, not the kind with rain and thunder, but the sort that erupts inside living rooms and dining spaces, where generations of disappointment, resentment, and quiet suffering are stirred into something potent and uncontainable, then finally spilled across a table dressed in pastel linens and glazed hams. The sky above was the kind of blue that postcards envy, but I barely noticed it. My mind was still processing the look on my father's face. That mixture of disbelief and wounded pride that only appears when a man raised on the illusion of control suddenly realizes he has none, and worse yet, that the daughter he so thoroughly underestimated had been pulling the strings on the very thing that kept his legacy from crumbling beneath him. For a few minutes, I stood just outside the front door, my hand grazing the wooden railing, listening to the muffled chaos behind me, hurried footsteps, low murmurs, a chair scraping across tile, my mother's voice somewhere in the distance saying my name like a prayer. But I didn't go back. I couldn't. Not because I was angry, that emotion had burned out years ago, but because I had finally spoken the truth, and returning to that room would mean stepping back into a role I no longer recognized as my own. I had played the quiet one, the overlooked daughter, the black sheep dressed in grays and shadows, for so long that even I had started to forget the full weight of what I had built in isolation, and now that the mask had shattered, I had no interest in picking up its pieces. Still, the moment lingered with an echo I hadn't expected, not regret, but something close to sorrow, like the ache that follows a long overdue surgery. Necessary, life-saving, but painful nonetheless. I hadn't come to brunch with the intention of blowing it all up. If anything, I had convinced myself that I would keep my silence intact, that I would sit through one more round of subtle dismissals and passive-aggressive praise for Emily, sip my drink, smile when appropriate, and leave with my dignity and my secrets undisturbed. But people like me, the ones who've spent years grinding in the dark, we don't often get clean breaks or quiet exits. When we finally speak, the truth has a tendency to scorch everything it touches. The door creaked behind me, and for a second I considered walking down the steps and pretending I hadn't heard it, but the footsteps that followed were lighter than my father's and steadier than my mother's. I turned slightly and saw Emily, her arms folded, her heels clicking softly across the porch as she made her way toward me. Her face didn't show anger, but it was guarded, that careful expression she always wore when she wasn't sure whether she was walking into a conversation or a confrontation. She leaned against the wooden railing beside me, letting the silence settle between us like it had so many times before, only now it felt different, heavier, more honest. After what felt like an entire minute, she finally spoke, her voice softer than I expected. "You could have told me, you know. About the company, the article, everything." I took a long breath, kept my eyes on the street in front of us, and replied, "And what would you have done with it? Brought it up over Christmas dinner? Mentioned it casually while Dad talked about the economy like he invented it." She didn't laugh, but a small exhale escaped her lips, not quite amusement, not quite irritation, more like resignation. "I'm not him, Jenna. You know that." I turned then, just enough to look her in the eyes, and for the first time in what felt like years, I saw the flicker of something real in her, not guilt exactly, but awareness. Maybe she had always known, somewhere beneath the surface, that the roles we'd been assigned were never entirely fair. Maybe she had chosen not to look too closely, because it was easier that way, because love with conditions was better than no love at all. I didn't blame her, not really, but that didn't make it easier to forget how often she'd stayed silent when her voice could have made all the difference. "You benefited from his version of things," I said, my tone more factual than bitter. "Even when you weren't trying to. You had his pride, his attention, his belief. I had his silence. I stopped telling you things not because I didn't trust you, but because I didn't think you'd care enough to listen." She didn't deny it. She just looked down at her hands, her nails painted a pale pink that matched the gloss on her lips, and said, "That was never fair to you." "No," I replied, "but fairness was never part of the deal in this family." A long silence followed, the kind that didn't need to be filled, and then she looked back at me, eyes sharper now. "Why did you do it?" "Save his company. You could have let it fall apart." Walked away. Watched him drown in the same arrogance he fed you for years. It was a good question. One I had asked myself more than once, especially during the sleepless nights after the wire transfer cleared, when I lay awake wondering if saving the man who never once lifted me up made me strong or just foolish. I searched for the answer, then spoke slowly, as if tasting the truth for the first time. Because I wanted to prove that I was never the one who needed him. That I could carry the weight he never believed I could handle. And maybe I did it for Mom. Because as much as she looked away, she didn't deserve to lose everything he built just because he couldn't see past his own ego. Emily nodded slowly, not quite in agreement, but in understanding, and then after a moment, she asked, "Will you tell him?" I shook my head. "I already did." She gave a small, bitter smile. "Fair enough." As she stepped back inside, leaving me alone once more, I felt a calmness begin to settle, not peace exactly, but a kind of closure I hadn't realized I needed. The truth had been laid bare. The illusions had been shattered. And now, for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't trying to be seen. I wasn't waiting to be acknowledged. I had done what needed to be done, not for recognition, but because I could. Because the version of me they tried so hard to ignore had quietly become the one holding the reins. I stayed there on the porch a little longer, the sun creeping higher in the sky, the distant sounds of clinking plates and murmured voices drifting through the walls. Maybe they would talk about me after I left. Maybe they'd piece together all the missed signs and whispered clues and finally begin to see me for who I was, or maybe they wouldn't. Maybe they'd retreat into their comfort, into their narrative, into the same story they'd been telling for years, the one where Emily was the success and I was the mystery. But it didn't matter anymore. I didn't need them to rewrite the story. Because I had written my own, every word, every chapter, every hard-won page, and I didn't need applause to know that it mattered. And as for my father, who would now spend the rest of his days knowing that the daughter he dismissed was the reason his business still bore his name. That was dessert. And it was served exactly how I wanted it, cold.